Hello everybody, this is Mythral Zenith, and welcome back to the Archanea map review series. We're talking about Chapter 3 today in Fire Emblem 1, 3, and 11, so hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's get on with it. Chapter 3 is an interesting one. This is where you meet Navarre. It's a brush in the teeth, or Devil Mountain, depending on what translation of the game you're using. We have a couple houses here, but first I want to talk about the deployment order. This is the last map that has a preset deployment in Shadow Dragon. The last map that the last map before you unlock battle prep. And so as you can see, we have the numbers still around here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So kind of spread out. Your first couple units start kind of central. The 5th unit starts up here by the village, and then your other units spread out. This is not true for every version of the map, though. That's just Shadow Dragon. In FE1, your very last unit starts up here, number 13. So you start centralized, you get some more units along the back, and then you get the units out front. This is important because if you lost any units, then they would not be... then you would not get the units out here. The order is how many of them are alive, and then based on join time. So if you haven't lost any units, you get 13 out here, which I believe would be either Caster or Daros, depending on who you recruited last. So most likely Caster, I believe, is what that would be, number 13. And then here in FE3, there's no units that start by the village, no units that start too far back. They're all clustered right here, so a little bit more, balanced sort of start position here compared to the more spread out of FE1 and FE11. Now, we talk about start positions. Can't forget Julian and Lena. They are up there. The mountains, you'll notice, were changed a little bit. There's a little bit more straight there. I think in here there's a little bit more of a curve, more open space up here. Very similar, but it looks like... or maybe it's just the stretched resolution, but it feels like it's a little more wide in FE11, whereas it feels... No, okay, so they definitely took out some of this and made it more open plains in FE3, so it's a little bit wider, and then it only condenses at the very end here. See, it's still 2 wide and then 3 wide. I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes specifically, but I do know that means that during the first turn or two, as they're coming out and chasing Julian and Lena, they are less bottlenecked, and so instead of forming very much a single file line the entire way down, they start and they just kind of flow out. I guess they get narrowed down to single file, but then they can flow out again, and then they're single file here. So if you charge straight up and attack them right up here where, your second turn of movement, their first or second turn of movement, they'll be able to surround you much more easily than if you attack them here in the mountain pass, where it's like just the one open square, and then maybe one of them will take a mountain or something. And same thing here with Shadow Dragon. It's a little harder to see, but you can see it's mostly single file, very tight. So FE3 changing the map again, making it a little bit wider up here. Let's get into the houses next, because the houses are still somewhat interesting. So Fire Emblem 1 and 11... once again, houses say mostly the same things. There's some slight deviations in wording, but one house talks about mercenaries having high skill and being able to do critical hits more effectively. A bit of a warning for Navarre here, who, granted, most of his critical hit chance is taken from his killing edge, not necessarily from his high skill stat, though it does still apply, as does Ogma. There's one that talks about hunters being stronger than archers, but having less defense. And then there's a house that talks about skill adding to crit, and speed adding to dodge. So if you're faster, you'll be more likely to avoid enemies. If you're more skillful, you'll be more likely to land hits and critical hits. So that sort of thing. Fire Emblem 11 says much the same way. The village gives a devil axe in all 3 versions of the game. And the map has a completion reward. You get gold upon completing the map. In Fire Emblem 1 and 11, you get 15,000. In Fire Emblem 3, you only get 10,000. Once again, this is consistent with what we've seen with the previous maps of Fire Emblem 3 just giving you less gold, whereas Fire Emblem 11 gives you the same amount of gold as FE1. Again, probably because FE1 just floods you with gold and doesn't have much to spend it on. FE3 narrows down the gold, whereas FE11 gives you more stuff later on, especially with forges and whatnot, to spend said gold. When we get to the houses in Fire Emblem 3, once again, you'll notice there are 4 houses instead of 3. And you'll notice all the houses tell different things. One talks about mercenaries critting, so pretty similar. One talks about speed, luck, and terrain increasing a void. So, first mention of luck and terrain. One talks about strength increasing weapon damage and magic damage and staff healing. Weapon damage, magic damage, and staff healing, which was not true of Fire Emblem 1. It was true of FE2, but not of FE1, so again, another thing of like, hey, if you're familiar with FE1, here's a difference that you might need to know. And one talks about sisters not fighting, but using staves. This is very similar, it's worded very similar to Riss's recruitment dialogue. It's like, I cannot fight, but I have this sacred staff that I can use to heal allies. This is important to add here because since Riss does not join you in Fire Emblem 3, Lena takes that place and is the first cleric you have, and thus you were given that dialogue in a house at her join chapter. So, fairly consistent overall. Let's talk about units. Now we have 5 fighters over here, plus the boss, and then 2 hunters. 3 fighters, 2 thieves, Navarre, and a hunter. I believe that is pretty much consistent there. Yeah, that's consistent here. And that's consistent here. So, no unit differences in terms of numbers, though the formation in Shadow Dragon is a lot more, I guess I'll call it pleasing to the eye here. It has that nice little symmetrical formation around the castle, whereas Fire Emblem 1 and 3 have the little more kind of spread out, scattered, more above, fewer below. Not that it really makes that much of a difference. I think some of these are static anyway, or don't come down until you're in range of them. Maybe some of them are aggressive. I forget exactly which ones are what. I do know that all of these, including Navarre, are aggressive, so it's another thing about there. Other than that, very few changes to this map overall. Again, moving around some mountains and forests, changing the deployment location, but, not too much. We see the tent, the supply tent in FE1, right behind the boss. That is absent in FE3 and FE11, of course, but the armory is still there in every version. You notice 2 save points in Fire Emblem 11, one right by your starting squad, so you could save pretty much at any time, probably for, hey, I want to talk to Navarre, and make sure you get that and don't get crit or something like that. Could be a good way to time that, so it's there for whenever you want to do a save. And then the second save point right here, so basically after you've dealt with all the other enemies and are just approaching the boss, you have a save point there. Pretty good overall. I like talking about the save point structure in Shadow Dragon because it and New Mystery are the only games that did that, and I think it is a very unique and interesting way of utilizing effectively save states without, giving you full, free, universal save states whenever, or doing turn wheel shenanigans. Aside from that, I do remember that the boss in particular in Hard 5 Shadow Dragon This is another one of those bosses that's very strong. I believe he also has a hand axe and is incredibly strong and fast. Notably fast because Navarre, with his starting bases, does not avoid getting doubled. He still gets doubled, so it's literally just Ogma. And I think Ogma might have to get a level up as well, like a speed level up to avoid getting doubled. Again, I forget the specifics, but another incredibly difficult boss and very frustrating. And you don't get a healing staff still, aside from he holds the mend staff. So in FE1 and FE11, you have Riss and his starting healing staff, but aside from that, it's just forts. In Fire Emblem 3, you still don't have a heal staff until you get a unit here. All you have is Warp. Lena starts with Warp, and not a healing staff. So it's very interesting that in FE3, the first staff you encounter in the game is Warp. Think about that for a minute. Nothing else too much to talk about. Again, like the previous chapter, it is a two-front chapter where you have one group that wants to save Julian and Lena, and another group that wants to go forward, push forward, and take the boss. You're encouraged to have Marth go left, one, because the castle's there, but two, because of the village here. You're encouraged to have Caeda move around the mountains, because she's needed to talk to Navarre. But be very careful, as this hunter has been known to kill Caeda for many players, myself included. The very first time I was playing this game, I didn't realize that these were forests and not mountains. And so the hunter just walked easily right onto them and killed Caeda, when I had stationed her like right here, thinking she would be safe. Obviously, we make mistakes, we reload, we try again, and everything's fine. But yeah, I remember that happening, and I was not happy about it. So having another person recruited by Caeda, I forget how the game even tells you that he's recruited by Caeda, aside from if you watch like some of the earlier things. No, he doesn't say my blade will never harm a woman. That's during his recruitment conversation with Caeda. I think you just kind of have to know. Maybe there's something that talks about it in the opening cutscene. You can let me know if they talk about it or not. Other than that, this is one of those Caeda recruitments that you just kind of have to know. Have to know and have to try it. But given this game, you primarily recruit units either with Marth or Caeda. There's very few exceptions to that rule, and they're usually pretty clearly spelled out. This is just kind of par for the course at this point. In terms of map structure, the difference between having like the thin aisle versus the slightly wider one, I don't think is too notable. Again, it does mean that a unit you send up could be more surrounded, but you know, not really too different. And then the boss area over here is not really changed. The slight changing of unit positioning around here doesn't really matter that much. It just looks a little more visually pleasing by being symmetrical. I forget what's in the armory. It's not super important. I think it's just some basic... Maybe you start getting some steel weapons here. Some more iron weapons and some steel weapons in case your weapons start breaking, which they're liable to start breaking now that you've had them for about 3 chapters. Yeah, not too much to say. They really liked having their split design maps where you split your army from the start and then you meet up later. In theory, if you charged up and then pushed around, you could meet up. But oftentimes what players do is they just go up a little bit, clash in the mountains, and then slowly follow down the southern route. I'm not the biggest fan of... Actually... Fire Emblem 1 has done this a lot now, where it's like, hey, split your army into 2 and fight 2 different fronts. And so they're training the player in the early maps to split their army up and not move as a group in order to be more effective by putting enemies right there and putting the goal in a completely different direction. And since these are still the, I guess, one might call them tutorial maps or training maps, even though they're full-fledged maps, they're not just tutorials. They definitely are real game, and in fact, if you're playing FE11, they are not part of the prologue, so they're definitely not tutorial maps. They're still the early maps of the game. They're still maps in which people are still feeling out what to do, how to play, and all this, and so I do think that it is a good decision overall to be introducing these same sorts of things, and just consistency in terms of, we keep showing you maps where you want to split your units so you can learn to manage units on two fronts, because as we'll see in a soon future map, you will get units on two fronts that you have to manage simultaneously, and so learning these skills of remembering units that aren't all on the same screen is important. So, interesting thought there. I don't know if it necessarily bears too much repeating. There's nothing that really screams out at me on this map, aside from, again, the really narrow choke point here. There is a fort right on the open side of the mountains, so if you don't feel confident about fighting a string of 1v1 v1v1s in the mountains, or if the enemy is moving into the mountains and surrounding you, you can fall back to the fort, get some healing, get a little bit of terrain advantage. And again, same thing with here. If you want to move forward quickly, you can take the fort and then fight the enemies here through the fort, and it's the only pass through the mountains. But if the enemies sit on the fort, then you have to fight through them on the fort. So forts in strategic places, I'm always a fan of, and I do like that. There's some terrain loosely around with the forests, but none particularly in places that you'll take advantage of. It's just like the mountains up here, the fort right here, maybe this fort, and then you'll notice that these forests are obstructing this path, so if you try to take it, you will definitely learn that the forests slow your movement. And that's kind of all there is to know about... Come on, click, there we go. That's all there is to know about the terrain on this map. Units not particularly interesting. Like I said, the one hunter is very annoying and rude to people trying to recruit Navarre with Caeda. The two hunters down here, again, kind of ward off Caeda from doing any shenanigans. Not that there's really much room for her to do stuff which, like, that's cute or tricksy. You'll be flying in and then being attacked by like 4 enemy units anyway. Yeah. That's chapter 3. Join us next time for chapter 4, I guess. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any other comments or questions about this chapter, let me know. And until next time, this is Mithril Zenith, signing out.